Hello, my friends. Welcome to Tackle the Beast. Today, we're going to very swiftly tackle the area of scope. I'm going to show you how everything is interconnected. We're going to do it really quick. So here we go with the very first process. The very first process is known as plan scope management. Plan scope management gives you two very important plans. One is the scope management plan, and the second one is the requirements management plan. And these plans are used throughout project management. We're going to put a face to the name so that we don't forget it. So here is your requirements management plan. And it's a plan that helps you collect, update, track requirements. And the second one is the scope management plan. And it's a plan that helps guide you on how to manage scope. And these first two are then going to become inputs to the next process. So the next process is collect requirements. Collect requirements. And collect requirements is going to give you an output where you have the requirements traceability matrix, and something known as requirements documentation. So what is a requirements traceability matrix? It tracks requirements to their origin. It's pretty much like a table with multiple columns and rows, and you have various fields, but one of the fields is the requirements with an ID, and the other field that's very important is the origin, who asked for it. And that is known as a requirements traceability matrix. So let's put the matrix on the screen. I know some of you have trouble remembering these, and hopefully these images will help jog your memory. All right, and the second one is requirements documentation. And this is any other document that you use to track requirements. And these documents should show how the requirements meet the need of the business. We refer to that as requirements documentation. All right, now, for those of you who are following along really carefully, I want to show you one thing in chapter 5. Just follow along so you don't get lost. There's a lot that I'm going to be showing you here. So if you go to page 138, you can see both the scope management plan and requirements management plan are indicated as inputs to this process of collect requirements. Now, if you go to page 150 and you take a look at project documents, the only thing you see going in here is the requirements documentation. Now, I'm not going to get into any arguments as far as why didn't they put the traceability matrix? Well, I would say just like you, who knows? But anyway, we don't have the matrix mentioned. Instead, what we see is requirements documents leading in to the next process. And the next process is define scope. And define scope is where we take these requirements and we make a final selection of what is going to make it into the final set of requirements and what is not. And consequently, one of the major outputs we get from here is known as a project scope statement, to spell all of it out. Project scope statement. Here's your project scope statement. And your project scope statement has inclusions, exclusions, deliverable acceptance criteria. All that stuff is in here. All right. Now, this scope statement, along with other things, and follow me once again, we're going quite rapidly to page 156. If you take a look at page 156 and you look under the inputs, you're going to see the project scope statement going into create WBS along with requirements documentation again. So taking a look at this, you should get the idea that the requirements documentation is quite important, right? Together with the project scope statement, they go into a process, and this process is known as create WBS, create the work breakdown structure. And this is where we create the WBS, which is a hierarchical decomposition of the work to be done. Now, instead of getting an output known as WBS, you don't get a WBS, you get something even better. Buy one, get three. So you get something known as a scope baseline. And the scope baseline, if we can zoom in here, you can see that it has the WBS, a WBS dictionary to explain each element of the WBS, and the project scope statement. You see that? It's your scope baseline. Very, very important for what you're going to be doing beyond this. Now, if you go to our next process, validate scope, what you're going to find is the scope management plan, the requirements management plan, and the scope baseline, all of those. So let's give you a visual for that. So you've got the scope baseline going into the next process, the requirements that we just talked about, traceability matrix, requirements, documentation, all those three, we see them going into the process that comes next. And the process that comes next is validate scope. And what happens in validate scope? This is where the customer checks the deliverables that you've sent in. And for that reason, one of the inputs that you have going in here, we call it a verified deliverable, which comes from control quality. But we have verified deliverables going in from validate scope. We could have an output known as accepted deliverables. And what is an accepted deliverable? It's one that has been signed off on by the customer. So I'm going to put an image here for you to remember that. Accepted deliverables. And your accepted deliverable will end up going to close project or phase eventually. We've got one more process to talk about, is control scope. And if you take a look, you see the scope management plan, requirements management plan, scope baseline, those three again. So we just hook into them one more time. Continue the journey. This goes in along with this and this to our final process. And this is control scope. And what happens in control scope? Well, as usual, you know that you're going to get WPI because you are in a monitoring and controlling process outside of integration. You know you're going to get change requests because whenever you have this control scope, control schedule, control cost, you know you're going to get one of those. And we have the two sidekicks, project management plan updates and project documents updates. And this is how you should think about scope. So very quickly, let's go back to the beginning. So we started off with plan scope management. We get these two plans, the requirements management plan and scope management plan. Those become an input to collect requirements. We get the requirements documentation and requirements traceability matrix. We see mention made of the requirements documentation going into defined scope. And from there, we get a project scope statement as an output. And then we see for the next process, the project scope statement going to create WBS. And of course, we can have other things that we point into create WBS. You can see requirements documentation going in there. Of course, scope management plan would as well. And here we have the output, the scope baseline. It's going to validate scope. And along with that, we have from previous requirements documentation, requirements traceability matrix. We end up getting accepted deliverables because verified deliverables went in there. And in control scope, We have these three, again, going into control scope, and we can get a WPI, change request, PMPU, and PDU as outputs. The purpose is not for you to cram this, but it's really to help you understand it in a more organic fashion so that when you come across questions that need it, that require this knowledge on your exam, you will not be struggling. I hope that helped you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. You take care. Bye for now.